So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Confidence for Translation Information Workshop. My name is Ellie Marinopoulou, and I'm a Translational Research Manager. And together with my colleague, Alessandra Faroni, who is also on the call, we manage Translation Manchester. So Translation Manchester coordinates this C4T call. And together with us is also Sam Butterworth, the academic lead for the UKRI MRC Impact Accelerator account, which primarily funds this call. So this is the agenda for today. We will start by providing some information about the call, including timelines. And then I will hand it over to Sam to tell you more about the do's and don'ts when it comes to writing your application and what constitutes a strong application. And then we will briefly cover the new costing process. This will hopefully leave us around 40 minutes to answer any of your questions, including eligibility questions, as well as questions on specific parts of the application. To help answering the questions in the call today, we also have with us Sonia Nikolovsky from Innovation Factory to help address any questions related to IP matters. And we also have Connie Funky-Dooley, Research Services Operations Manager, to help address any questions relating to the costing process. To ask any questions, please either post them in the chat or raise your virtual hand. The workshop is recorded and together with the slides will be posted online and become available to you afterwards. So let's get started. So this is our 2024 Confidence for Translation scheme. It is essentially a proof of concept scheme designed to help researchers overcome a specific bottleneck that prevents them from progressing along the translational pathway. The projects need to address an unmet clinical need or improve an aspect of healthcare delivery. We're looking at projects that fit broadly within 4 categories. This is therapeutics, diagnostics, digital interventions, and devices. The award does not intend to fund the entire project, but rather help you address that specific bottleneck. And it is meant to de-risk projects with the view of enabling follow-on funding for external applications. We welcome applications from all stages of the translational pathway, from early stages, proof of concept, up to later stages, including clinical investigations. We award up to 75K per project, and you need to show how this funding will help you progress along the translational pathway, and Sam will tell you more about this shortly. Projects can be of any duration, typically between 6 to 9 months, but we also accept projects up to 12 months. This year, we accept applications with remit similar to our Access to Expertise scheme, which means that you can claim costs to access particular expertise, external expertise, such as a consultant. Other costs you can claim include funding for postdocs or technicians, as well as consumables. With regard to timelines, the call is now open, and the deadline for submitting your applications is 10th of July. Please note that this is a single-stage application process. We will be reviewing your applications over the summer, and the panels will be held in September. The outcomes will be communicated to the applicants in October, with the project starting shortly after. And with this, I will hand over to Sam to tell you more about the do's and don'ts when it comes to writing your application. Sam, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. So the purpose of this section is just give you a bit of a guidance on from experience of running this scheme for some years in its previous incarnation as the MRC KIC and the Wellcome Trust programs through to this sort of combined program. Just some tips around things to include or to make sure that are covered or explained in the application clearly, to give you guys the best chance of showcasing your projects and proposals in a way that's likely to land well with the panel. The comment around the fact that this is now a single stage process, whereas historically the MRC KIC has been in 2 stages, makes this even more important, because there's no in the previous kind of 2-stage process, you could get feedback from the panel that could help you guide your full application. In this case, that won't be possible, and that's been driven by the MRC timelines with the extension of the awards. That means we've had to condense to a single stage. So there's more pressure on getting it right first time now. So any of these solutions really have to address a clear unmet need in sort of treatment or support of patients. That could be in the UK or a more global problem, but you need to understand and to be able to articulate what it is you're trying to do for what particular type of a patient with your intervention, whether that's a new therapeutic or a diagnostic or a device or a digital health solution. You need to be able to identify what that is and to articulate why this thing that you're trying to do needs doing in the context of the current clinical treatment landscape. So making a clear case for that unmet need and how your technology is going to address it. And linked to that, one of the challenges you have, particularly working on earlier stage projects that might have multiple downstream applications, is I guess been knowing that there's potentially a breadth of opportunities, but really having to focus on one. And this will be true of all translational applications. It's very, very hard to actually sell two different applications or ideas in the same proposal, because you're just always very limited on space, even looking for much bigger awards than these. So we really strongly encourage you to pick what you think is the most directly applicable and important application of your technology and focus on that in the application rather than looking more broadly. So next slide, please. So the next important point, once you've identified that patient population, how your technology applies, is to really clearly articulate what you're trying to achieve with this project. So as Ellie said, it's not going to be possible or almost never going to be possible to fund a whole project for £75,000 or less. You really are going to be looking, or we really are looking for projects that have a key hurdle, a key unknown feature that currently it means the project is carrying probably too much risk to be or lacks answers to some critical questions that it would need to be able to address in order to be eligible to go for larger external funding, and by which funding this stage, and if we're successful or you're successful in generating that data, will make for a much more credible application. So one way of thinking what are these key hurdles is it's that kind of what is the most awkward question you could be asked, what's the thing you don't want the reviewers to pick up on in your application that is the data point that you really need in order to make the most compelling case you can. Considering as part of this the sort of line of sight and ultimate path to the utilization of this project in patients. So the key hurdle might not necessarily be an experimental one, as to Alessandro's point, that could be a consultancy question around actually how would you go about doing this translation, what's the right shape of the next project potentially. But you need to think holistically about your projects, and we do encourage people to think about these target product profiles and what are the essential criteria that this technology will ultimately have to be achieved to be clinically useful. And that can perhaps broaden your thinking out a little bit beyond just the potentially more narrow experimental focus that many of us will have on our projects. Another key point to address is we really are looking for projects that are going to be addressing risk. So it's fine that the project is risky and that it might fail. In fact, MRC encourage us to have failed projects, because if we're not having projects that don't meet their endpoints, then we're not funding things that are risky enough, probably. But on the flip side of that, if a project looks like it's doing something which is important for the translational pathway, but isn't really going to de-risk the project, it could just be the first work package in that next larger application, then it may well not be as favorably reviewed, because it's not likely to make as big a difference for that project as it would perhaps for another one where there is more risk at this stage. So it's just worth considering that. Next slide, please. So part of this then comes about thinking about what is that next grant application. So like I said, we're really, we're looking for projects that are going to progress down the translational pathway. We're only giving them a small amount of money. And so there is going to have to be some next stage for these projects. So thinking about what are the next funding applications, and lots of people write MRC DPFS on there, but thinking about what actually that application needs to look like particularly if you have applied to one of these external schemes and you have any feedback that has helped you shape this application, it's reassuring for the panel to see that is in there, and this risk has been almost validated by the panels from external reviewers. You need to make sure that you have freedom to exploit the innovation. So there does not need to be a commercial outcome from these projects. They don't need to be in commercially viable indications, but there has to be a path to translate what you're doing through to patient benefit. So if you're taking, for example, in my area, a drug that's owned by another company and showing it works in another indication, if that drug is the only drug in that space, and if you can't get authorization from that company to do any further work with that drug later, that project is effectively carrying a huge risk that probably won't allow it to be funded. So you need to have the freedom to exploit, and that can be true of kind of more obvious industrial collaborations, but it's also true if you have academic partners. If the IP is owned by another academic institution, and you don't have a clear path forwards, if they decide they don't want to work with you anymore after this stage of the project, that can be a problem. So using something as an exemplar where there are perhaps other things you could move to in the future is fine. But if you are wedded to someone else's IP, it does create a problem, not for the commercialization, but just for the ability to actually progress the project later. These are kind of more general tips now, so they're a bit more all over the place. When you write the application, so the panel will be a mixture of external translational experts and academics from the university. Everyone will have some expertise in the translational research space, but it's very unlikely that anyone will have any real detailed specific expertise of the area that you're working in specifically. So make sure that the application isn't overly technical and is understandable to someone with a sort of a broad scientific background. It's great to see preliminary data, and it's great to see claims about how useful this technology is likely to be in the future. But you make sure those things are aligned. We're aware that these are early stage projects. Making really big claims off the back of data that's not very supportive of those claims can obviously not look very good in front of the panel. So particularly, again, as a generic example, diagnostics, which can separate groups statistically significantly, but actually with what looks like very little clinical utility in terms of the separation between the two populations, for example, might be something that we've seen before. So this is just, I guess, a little summary. So making sure that you really identify that bottleneck or hurdle and how it can be addressed, showing that that's going to make a real difference in the translation of the project and the ability to attract further funding. We really like to see clear and specific objectives with milestones. That doesn't mean we're likely to withdraw the funding if those milestones aren't met, but that kind of translational thinking and ability to communicate the key aspects of your program is important. Thinking about the long-term and short-term vision and how you're going to obtain that follow-on funding, making sure the IP situation is clear. If you try and kind of gloss over that, it will probably be picked up on by someone in the panel. Making sure you have the people in place. We do accept applications for unnamed postdoc positions, but obviously, those projects do carry a little bit of a risk, but that's probably fine. And making sure you have all the licenses and ethical approvals in place, or you have a really clear plan of how you're going to get those. Again, we will normally see at least one application a year where someone claims they don't need ethics for their proposal when it's very clear that they do, for example. So again, that doesn't look good with the panel. So making sure this is kind of on the flip side, common mistakes as, applications which include work that perhaps isn't translationally relevant, or it's not clear to the reviewers what the translational relevance of the research that's being done is. Project that lack sufficient technical details. So everyone will be under a CDA, so there's no concerns around disclosure in here. So you do need to explain what you're doing with sufficient sort of technical information. Having said that, obviously, as I said before, getting super technical in terms of language and things might not be helpful. Making sure you have the key expertise in the team. One obvious component here is clinical input. All of these are going to be healthcare solutions. They're likely to ultimately need a clinician of some description to be part of the team going forwards, and the sooner you can bring people like that in, if they're not in your team already, the sooner you can start to get some link between your theory about how these things are going to be applied and the reality, particularly in the UK. Making sure that your study design and sample sizes are fully justified. Again, we will have statistical support in the review process. So if that doesn't look clear, you may have a problem. Making sure everything is kind of sensible and justified in terms of the work amount, that you've written decent milestones. And then the last point I just want to take a few more seconds on is making sure that you really have articulated the competition in the space you're working in, and how your approach is differentiated. And you don't have a lot of words in this proposal, unfortunately, but failure to address this can be a really big problem in the review stage. So competition doesn't mean just the other people doing similar things to you, but it means other solutions trying to address the same unmet need. And so just, make sure you're aware of the landscape out there of what is currently being used and is in late stage of development or close to being applied. And those things will exist, very unlikely that anyone's working in an area where nobody else is interested. So it's fine that those things are out there, but you do have to try and have some rationale for why your approach is likely to be competitive and differentiated from those other approaches. And again, we will always get a few applications every year that don't or try to gloss over this box, and the panel will pick up on competition that because the applicants haven't raised means they haven't been able to address the differentiation from. Cool. Next slide, I think.
Yeah, great. Yes, thank you very much, Sam. So this is a slide to just summarize some of the key points that have been mentioned. So when it comes to writing your proposal, as Sam said, make sure that it's clear what's the underpinning problem or need. Explain where you are now in the translational pathway and what is the bottleneck that you're experiencing, what specifically your project will achieve, what are the alternative solutions and why yours is better, what are the risks and how you will manage them, and what is the long-term translational plan, so what's the vision. Now, regarding the costing process, so things have changed slightly this year. So we no longer require for the proposals to be fully costed at the application stage. That means that you should not contact research services to cost your proposal. We only ask for directly incurred costs to be estimated at this stage, and this can be done by you using the Black Daggle Research Costing Tool. This will give you more autonomy and will greatly reduce the time required to complete the application, as you no longer need to wait up to 4 weeks for research services to cost your application. Information on how to use Black Daggle can be found on the application brief and facts document, but we will be also holding a dedicated costing workshop for C4T applications on 25th of June to answer any questions you have about the costing process. Only successful projects will be fully costed by research services and based on the information that you have submitted. And this is how the costing sheet looks like. So as I've mentioned, you will be using the Black Daggle tool to estimate directly incurred costs, which you'll be filling in here. The tool will also provide you with a project ID and a budget ID that you will have to fill in here. So please make sure that the information you add here matches exactly what you have in Black Daggle, because the research services will use that information to fully cost your proposal if your application is successful. Another change this year is that we no longer require for you to obtain head of school approval to submit your application. We will do this for you if your application is successful. And I think this is the end of the presentation. So thank you very much for listening, and we are happy to take any questions.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, you're welcome to either come off mute or to put those questions into chat, whatever works best for you.
Okay, I have a question, Jason Bruce. So it mentions in the instructions, guidance notes, that the project has to start shortly after October. How strict is this adhered to, and what is the reasoning behind that? Is it possible to start a few months later, for example, as long as it ends by December, which I think is also the end date?
Yeah, it's the end date that's the important thing, because that's the end date of the award currently. So we need to make sure that every year to date, the MRC have extended those end dates anyway. But if they don't, then we need to make sure that the projects are finished before that deadline. Yeah.
Okay, so it could start, say, in April if it turns out that, say, a named postdoc, their current contract ends in March. You could start, say, in April and run it for 9 months. Would that be possible?
I think that's fine, Ellie. I don't know if you've got any comments, or Alessandro.
Yeah, I think that's fine. We've had that before.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question from anyone else?
Could I ask another one?
Yeah, sure.
So the IP situation, so does it just need to be properly articulated, or does IP need to be in place? What's the sort of guidance on that?
So I would say properly articulated is best. If you are developing something that you think is, University of Manchester IP, then obviously it would be great to engage with the Innovation Factory and Sony if you haven't already. And so often people have comments from their engagement with the TTO in applications. That's not unusual. If it's someone else's IP, then again, it's probably worth engaging with the TTO for some advice on that, but if you're not sure. But yeah, so we're not expecting this to necessarily to be fully nailed down, but it needs to at least be talked through. Yeah.
Okay.
Got a question from Stephen?
Yeah, can I just ask about, can we include equipment in the application in terms of, can we cost that onto it?
Yes, for sure. I guess it needs to be very clear that that equipment is essential for delivery of the project and isn't something which is just going to support your research but could be available elsewhere in the university to deliver a short piece of work, right? So it needs to be very clearly needed by the project. I mean, often, particularly in the devicey space or people doing early kind of feasibility trials with devices, whatever, then the purchase of that equipment ends up on the award. So it certainly wouldn't be unusual for us to fund some applications that include quite a significant amount of equipment costs. But if you were to say, I need a new qPCR machine, we would say, no, you don't, kind of thing.
And in terms of a limit to the cost that the equipment can be, is that just a case-by-case basis?
It would be case by case. Again, if you've got if you think you're concerned about that, I would suggest you email the general, the Translation at Manchester address and ask for guidance. It's not an unusual question for us to be asked. I mean, the short answer is it would be case by case. But again, the more you're putting onto that equipment, the more clear it has to be that this equipment is going to be absolutely needed and not just a high risk of just burning that cash on something that's going to ultimately not be useful for the project.
Yeah. Thanks.
Joe?
Hi, thanks. Can the long-term translational plan include an application for a patent? Have you had that before, or do you want immediate patient translation in therapeutics?
I mean, having a plan to protect what you're doing with a patent, if that's a credible and useful part of the process to go forwards, if you've got something that's patentable and is likely to have commercial value and likely to need commercial funding to progress, or maybe not even need, but that be a likely path forwards, then it would be good to talk about that. Again, I think that would be good to engage Innovation Factory. I guess a patent alone isn't translation, right? A patent is a tool that will allow you to translate the project. And I suppose the flip side of that is if you're coming with something that is going to need very expensive clinical development plan and you have no route to protecting the IP, then that's probably a big problem in the other direction, because it's going to be very hard to take forward a very expensive clinical development program using only non-commercial funding, basically grant funding. So for certain types of projects, patentability and it will be really important. Yeah.
Thanks. Great.
Can I just chip in there?
Yep.
I think in terms of the patentability side of it, if you were to contact me or one of my other colleagues at the Innovation Factory with your application, then what we would do is to actually check whether it is theoretically patentable, because you can't make the assumption that it is. Someone else may have done the work or something quite similar previously, and it may not be patentable. So therefore, the IP situation would be different. It would be requiring access to someone else's intellectual property. So it'd be worth a conversation in that regard.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
And Claire, another hand up.
Hi, I just have an eligibility question. So I think we're a bit slightly further along. So we're currently running a phase 1 trial. And what we're doing is we do a funding for it's a safety and efficacy, a safety and feasibility study. We have money for the trial, but we have no money for any kind of translation analysis of any of the tissue that we're collecting. Does that kind of fall within the remit? Because the idea is it might inform on the next stage if we can find kind of like a biomarker or something like that. Would that fall within the remit of this scheme?
I think, as I often answer these, I don't think you're going to have a remit problem there.
Okay.
I think you need to think about what is the key hurdle that you need to address. Just, we've got this data, we've got access to it, and we want to analyze it because there's probably something interesting in there.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't a hurdle. It's
Well,
that's a research project, right? So, and I'm not asking you to address that now, but just to think
Okay.
about it, right? You need to think about why, and we've had similar questions before, and it often comes up in the panel. How have they managed to get all the funding to do this without actually getting funding for the outputs they need to take it forward to the next stage already anyway, if that makes sense. So we need, that just needs to be very clearly articulated.
Okay.
If there is a real hurdle, and if the analysis of that data is going to address that hurdle and enable you to get the next stage of funding, then great. The risk is you're going to have to make it very clearly evident that this isn't just we've got this data and we want to see what's in there type of question, because that is a research project, not translational, right? Even if you think what we might find in there may be translational, right? It's still just a kind of a looking for stuff project, right? It would be unlikely to get supported, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know, Alessandro, if you've got any different views to that.
No, I think that was spot on.
We have any questions in the chat?
From
Yes. Yeah.
Jackie, can we get some advice regarding the future project funding plan? I mean, I think, again, it's worth just thinking through what for your particular project is going to be needed. It will be different for different types of projects, whether this is NHR or MRC DPFS or direct commercialization through the Innovation Factory, whatever, we don't have a preference over what is the path forwards that applicants are choosing to follow. But we do like to see that they've thought about it and that the next steps are credible based on what they're proposing. So if you are proposing to apply to MRC DPFS, I guess we ideally want to see a project where it feels like that project is nearly ready to go to MRC DPFS, and it's this experiment that's going to make the difference. If it looks like it's still likely to be probably too early, for want of a better term, for DPFS, even after this data is generated, then that might not look as good with the panel. You may need to think about what other awards you might be able to use to bridge to that larger translational.
Thanks, Sam. Basically, we currently just finished the pilot study for this project, and the data looks good. So we are hoping that using the C4T to expand our pilot study for a more appropriate patient cohort, to see if the model we are looking at is actually that effective in diagnosing the patients. So, but this is as far as we have thought. So we haven't thought any further beyond that point. So I think that's why I think the most difficult question in this application will be if they ask us, what is your future project plan? So it will be more difficult for us.
I mean, I think my advice, this doesn't have to be like the application is fully written and we're just going to drop this data point in and submit it kind of level of GREST. But I mean, I would advise you to think about what would we do if we were successful, right? Because ultimately that is the question, right? If this works, if we get the data we want from this stage of the project and it validates this approach, what would we do next, right? And if you don't have a plan for that, then that will probably come across in the application. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? You can put them in the chat or raise your hand. As we've mentioned before, the workshop is recorded and everything will become available to you. This is the second workshop we are running. So we had one on the 12th of June, and both of them will be available, including the questions that have been asked. They're different questions and, will be useful to you. Is there anything else you'd like to ask?
Yep, Silky.
Sorry, we're in clinic, and I thought we could dial in. But it's good that you said this will become available. Then Conal and you can just check on and listen to the recording. My main question is that we were actually hoping we are a step further. We have a biomarker study that is still rather an idea, where we both are convinced of the translational potential, but if we haven't a lot of prelim data, are we too early for a C4T? Do we really need to wait until we have gathered some prelim data because it takes us too long in rare diseases to actually get them? Or can we actually come with a new idea for a C4T because we think from external data and what others have done, this is feasible, and it's just that we need some starting point?
Again, you might want to send an email to the translation team with a bit more details of what you're thinking of there, and we can just give you perhaps a bit more specific advice. I would say generally diagnostics is obviously covers lots of different things, but for the most sort of typical type of diagnostic project, this stage would be you've got a preliminary signal from a test cohort, and you need to validate that in a larger independent cohort in order to verify that signal is real and reproducible, right? In a more targeted experiment. If that preliminary data came from externally and you wanted to validate that in an internal cohort, and that was, it was very clear why that was important, etc., then maybe you'd be on the edges of being in. It would be more typical for us to see a project where someone had run their own study and we're now looking to revalidate those findings in an independent cohort. That would be the kind of classic stage of a diagnostic project. That if you didn't have that data and then you went and applied to someone else, they would say, well, you need it first because
I think I have one of these smaller sessions booked tomorrow, so I probably just discuss it more in detail than tomorrow. And after I've spoken with Conal again about it, because the idea sounds really promising, but if we're too early, then it's just
we don't want to waste anyone's time with writing a whole application that's going to instantly fall to the bottom of the pile. Absolutely. So hopefully, you can get that advice. Yeah.
Great. Are there any more questions? Can't see anything in the chat.
No, I think we're good.
Okay. Right. So if there aren't any more questions, then I guess we will bring this to a close, and we will post this online. But as Sam mentioned, if you have any other questions regarding eligibility or anything about the application, you can always get in touch with us and we will get back to you, trying to have a meeting to discuss. Great. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Look forward to seeing your applications. Cheers.
Thanks.